breaking news.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Cyril Vanier at the CNN Center. Breaking news out of Cuba. Fidel Castro has died. We're now in a position to confirm that. The former president and revolutionary leader was 90 years old. For years, he had been out of the public eye. Rumors have periodically surfaced about his death, but now we can confirm that Fidel Castro has indeed passed away in Havana. And this is something that has been a possibility that has been considered, that has been floated many times in recent years in Havana. He's been in poor health. Fidel Castro already politically handed over the reins of power in Cuba to his brother Raul Castro a number of years ago. So there are going to be questions going forward about how the country is going to transition. He cast obviously a very long shadow on the history of Cuba, but his brother is now holding the reins of that country. Fidel Castro, who was born in 1926 in Biran, Cuba. He led the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Turning the island nation into the first communist regime in the Western Hemisphere. And Castro ruled Cuba for nearly 50 years, first as prime minister and then as president for more than 30 years. He was known for his long, fiery speeches, his military fatigues, and his cigars, of course. He brought social reforms to Cuba that he's been widely criticized for oppressing human rights and freedom of speech. During his reign, thousands of Cubans fled for the U.S., Health problems finally forced Castro to resign the presidency in 2008. He named his brother Raul as his successor. And of course, in his lifetime, before he passed away, he will have seen his country, Cuba, become once again a lot closer to the U.S. as diplomatic relations were restored months ago. It's going to be interesting to see moving forward how and if, in what respect and in what way Fidel Castro's death may affect the politics of Cuba. His brother Raul Castro is now running the country. It's unclear that there's going to be much of a change in how the country is being run. Raul has been essentially putting forward the same policies as his brother Fidel Castro. Of course, CNN teams are now working across the world to bring you the various implications of this death. One of the great figures of the 21st century. People remember his name on a par with Nelson Mandela. Very different, obviously, political paths. But one of the names that will be remembered to have marked the 20th and the 21st century. So if you're just joining us here on CNN, I'd like to remind you this breaking news. We can now confirm to you that Fidel Castro, the former president of Cuba, has passed away. So page is being turned in Cuba. Do stay with us for CNN. We're going to break for just a second. We'll be back with more after this. All right. All right, we're going to stay with you, and we're going to stay on this, of course. Our teams are currently working to pull as much information as we can on what's going on. For the moment, what we can tell you is that Fidel Castro has passed away, the former Cuban president, who had handed over the reins of power to his brother Raul Castro a couple of years ago. And, of course, Cuba has been undergoing dramatic change over the last few years, and especially over the last few months, as diplomatic relations have been restored with his former nemesis, the U.S. It's going to be interesting to see going forward what impact the death of Fidel Castro may have. There's the psychological impact for people who have known Fidel Castro as the leader of that country and essentially a father figure for Cuba for many years now. Will that change? What's it going to change psychologically for Cubans? What's it going to change for the politics of that country? All of those questions we're going to be getting answers to in the hours and I dare say in the days to come. The former president and revolutionary leader was 90 years old. For years he'd been out of the public eye. Rumors have periodically surfaced about his death, but we can now confirm, if you're just joining us here on CNN, that Fidel Castro has passed away in Havana. He was born in 1926 in Biran, Cuba. He fled the Cuban Revolution in 1959, turning the island nation into the first communist regime in the Western Hemisphere. You're seeing pictures of him there with Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. Castro ruled Cuba for nearly 50 years, first as prime minister and then as president. And as those pictures serve to remind us, Cuba in general, and Fidel Castro in particular, cast a long shadow not just over the politics of that country, but over the region as a whole. Of course, Cuba played a particular role with Venezuela and continues to do so. The recent Colombian peace accord between the Colombian government and the FARC rebels was brokered in Cuba, talks happening there for years, and this just serves to remind us of the influence that Fidel Castro has had over Cuba and indeed over the Caribbean and Latin American region over a number of decades now. Patrick Ottman is joining us over the line from Havana, Cuba. Patrick, appreciate you being with us. What can you tell us at this stage? And I know it's still early hours.
That's right. This news has landed like a bomb on Cuba, a man who has ruled this island and had an influence across the world for some 60 years now, and we're just beginning to feel the after effects. It was an announcement made at the end of an event, a fairly typical event here, to mark a revolutionary anniversary. And what I'm told is that Raul Castro took to the stage to announce that Fidel Castro has died. Of course, the iconic leader who has angered U.S. presidents for decades. Some have called him a dictator, others a freedom fighter, but a man who has lived a life like few others, and apparently that life has come to an end. Raul Castro, Fidel Castro's younger brother, the current president of Cuba, announcing tonight that Fidel Castro has died at age 90, and this is going to be an event that we're going to be talking about for the days to come, perhaps the weeks to come, and certainly an event that many have been waiting for. Fidel Castro's been in bad health for so many years now, but he continued on, and over the years we saw less and less of him, but he still had incredible influence, certainly in Cuba and around the region. This is a man who, in Latin America and in Africa, for leftist governments, was the first world leader to really stand up to the United States, the leader who established a communist government just 90 miles from the United States, a leader who lived a life like few others and risked death throughout his career. But as well, his reign here had an amazing toll on so many people, tens of thousands, millions
Patrick, I'd like to cut you off there for a second. Of course, I know that throughout the course of the night here and for the next coming days, we're going to be analyzing the impact of his death. What I'd like to know right now is, how do Cubans feel about him today? Insofar as they talk about him, and I know that free speech in the realm of politics in Cuba is a relative thing, but how do they feel about him today? Is it this patriarchal, patrician figure? Is he revered, or is there a lot of criticism, or is it ambivalent?
There is a bit of both, but really this is someone who has affected millions of people's lives, not always for the better. And Cubans have long waited to see what would happen after Fidel Castro passed away. A lot of people feel that real change couldn't happen in Cuba until Fidel Castro passed. That is now taken place, we're told, by his brother, Raul Castro. And so the aftershocks are going to be felt here for some time, even though this is a man who was not, for the last 10 years, in a position of power. But this is how big a figure he struck here, that even after leaving office for 10 years ago, having a peripheral role in Cuban life, but you look over the history again, the Bay of Pigs, the missile crisis. This is someone who has led really quite an epic life, but at the cost of so many people who had to flee this island. So I know people will celebrate in Florida, and people will mourn him in Havana, but I think most people will wonder, how will this affect their life now? Will ordinary Cubans' lives improve?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Patrick, I'd like to get back to a part of my question here, which was really about the emotional tie to Fidel Castro. And the reason I ask is because a majority of Cubans today will have only known Fidel Castro as the leader of Cuba. So what kind of emotional ties do they have to him?
His speeches have been the soundtrack of their life. Of course, he took power in 1959. So people have either known, Cubans have either known Fidel Castro or Raul Castro, a president named Castro, for their entire lives. They really can't imagine. You would ask Cubans, what do you think will happen after? And they just can't imagine a life without Fidel Castro or someone named Castro in power. So today is